All right, so my name is Nils Swart. Work at Plexxi in a number of capacities, and one of them is kind of odd, it's business development. But what I really work on at the business development side is figuring out which companies or which projects that our company should work together with. And one of the topics that we'll be talking about today is largely OpenDaylight, and more specifically, sort of where OpenDaylight is, what we've done with OpenDaylight so far, where we see this going in the future, and perhaps take some of some of the questions around OpenDaylight off the table, specifically when it comes to people who believe that it's largely sort of a project from one very large vendor down the road, or it's some kind of way to muscle everyone else out of the market. So we'll go through that in sort of the next 20 minutes. If you've got questions, please feel free to fire them off. So OpenDaylight, why and sort of who are currently involved in OpenDaylight. Luckily, a couple of weeks ago, we had the first OpenDaylight summit here in the area, where a lot of this stuff was being discussed in great detail. But I'd say specifically our interpretation of why OpenDaylight is interesting is largely because the effort is not just about creating standards. This is about actually creating and writing code. This is important for us as a startup because we don't have thousands of engineers that could just sort of go off on a tangent and work on standards in the future. We actually want to see working code right now solving problems for customers today. So one of their key tenets is let's work on code. The other is community. Are there people that you can actually go and poke at who are writing that same code? In other words, they've got skin in the game to see this stuff actually being used. The sort of third portion of that is adoption. Like, can we get OpenDaylight to a point that that we are able to adopt some of that as Plexxi, but more importantly, the end users can start to run OpenDaylight going forward. So I'd say with that, it's almost more interesting to see what code is being generated than who is actually working on it. But it's kind of indicative to see that almost everyone in the valley has either joined in, but more importantly, a lot of the people on this graphic are actually contributing code. So our involvement from a Plexxi perspective started actually really early on, at the time of formation, but unfortunately not quite at the time they pulled the trigger. We were sort of in the discussions figuring out what should OpenDaylight become. So we were announced at Open Network Summit in April. Official press releases came later, but I think the more important milestone was that our project for the Affinity Metadata Service was accepted sort of summer of last year. So that kind of tells you a little bit what Plexxi wanted to do, and this is we've been very open about it. Affinity as an abstraction is sort of the currency or the lingua franca that we use to control large sections of our infrastructure and large section of our controller. And we've always said that it's not about the abstraction that's particularly Plexxi specific. It's what we do with it that's most important. So from our perspective, the more people that speak Affinity, or the more systems that speak Affinity, so to speak, the better it is for an industry in general. So our involvement has largely started with sort of the metadata project inside of OpenDaylight, and we're adding a bunch of stuff to that, and we'll go through both a demonstration and some forward-looking stuff. For those of you kind of unfamiliar with the rough architecture of OpenDaylight, I think the thing that is interesting in the entire SDN conversation is this is a controller platform that you can essentially take components from or plug components in as and how you see fit. More importantly, it's not just one individual protocol that's being standardized or being brought in the picture. So the green section here in the middle is pretty much the most important bit that's out there. It delivers you generalized service abstraction layer functionality, API exposure as well as API processing, things like general topology understanding, shortest path first calculation, host tracking, all that stuff. This is all, it's greatness that we don't have to rewrite it, if we go in and sort of take some of these components and bring them into any of our products. I think that's actually one of the key points that I kind of failed to land earlier on. With OpenDaylight, if that were around sort of 3 years ago when we formed Plexxi, it might have been the case that a lot of what is currently OpenDaylight would have been part of our product as it stands, or as it would stand then. So going forward, it will be easier for companies in the SDN space to focus themselves largely on their value add rather than sort of recreating and re-implementing the same feature set. So OpenDaylight, the architecture, certainly the first release that came out a couple weeks ago, took a while to actually harden that out. Has a bunch of OpenFlow southbound plugins, and we're using that in our demo later today. We're also using something in a project that Brent Salisbury has been working on quite heavily, OVSDB. He's been working on it with Madhu from Red Hat and a bunch of other people. By the way, it's really great. These guys, you can just kind of hit them on IRC while you're hacking on this stuff. Certainly, Derek has a lot of experience with kind of bringing them into the fold and trying to get the demo up and running. So from an architecture perspective, what we've been working on largely is the Affinity Metadata Service, as I talked about. And we've been adding functionality that you could look at as being southbound-ish type of infrastructure. And we'll go in a little bit more detail what that really means. But as a sneak preview, it allows us to represent a Plexxi infrastructure inside of the OpenDaylight in the OpenDaylight environment. And one of the things I set out to kind of dispel and sort of talk about a little bit is this is not just a project of one individual company. At about a year old, we've got companies from sort of all over the valley and outside of it. This is one of the pie charts that Anish Shaikh from IBM and now at Google has kind of put together. It shows a pretty interesting picture of the amount of activity on a per project basis and a per company basis. On its own, you can stare at this pie chart all day long, but what's almost more important is how do you compare that to another big project, for instance, OpenStack, when they were a year old? And the interesting thing is that the pattern is very similar. So both the criticism and perhaps some of the the positive things that were said back then about OpenStack, same thing might apply here. This is not just a single vendor pushing everything here. Lots of interaction already and skin in the game from the various companies out there. We've got a tiny share here, tiny company, but we're certainly looking to grow this, as we'll see in a bit. So from our perspective, what's the current state of affair for the platform? Would we run our own infrastructure on it as of today? The answer is, maybe not just yet. So we'll wait another release before we do that. But there's a very good basis. There's a very reasonably stable basis for things that you want to do on a per flow basis. It's very flow oriented, which was an interesting challenge for our team to work on because not everything in our system is flow based. It's largely path based. And I'll let Derek talk more about this point, but Java is it's Java. Our engineering team is very familiar with Java. A lot of our stuff is written on it. It has its very positive sides and also some challenges. In general, for the project, there's lots of work in progress. Persistency of state is certainly one of the big challenges that are being undertaken. Different forwarding models that exist, so we're trying to merge a couple of projects together to settle on sort of some one or maybe two forwarding models. And sort of lastly, what's kind of really interesting, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, is internal abstractions. So you've heard Plexxi talk a lot about abstractions in the form that we consume on our controller, say affinities, and that's all good. Those are abstractions that live at the top of an infrastructure. But I would argue that some of the sort of indicators that a controller architecture is starting to mature more is when internal abstraction discussions are going towards the foreground, so to speak. So for those who have heard something about it and want to have a small primer, this is interesting to listen to this part. We're moving inside of OpenDaylight from sort of an API-driven service abstraction layer to a model-driven one, which I'll summarize in the next slide. But in essence, what it boils down to is instead of hand coding a lot of the APIs that you're exposing and predefining relationships between modules before you kind of load them in the controller, you can do that much more on a real-time basis and extend your controller sort of in a real-time basis as soon as you move towards a model-driven service abstraction layer. What you'll also see in this more detailed picture that I've blatantly ripped out of the presentation is that some of the modules that are currently out there, including our own Affinity service, metadata service, they're largely built around what was then available, the API-driven service abstraction layer. So we've got some work ahead of us to move that over to a model-driven service abstraction layer. But I'd say from a maturity perspective, it's excellent to see this conversation happening over the last 4 or 5 months, and certainly going forward into the next few months. Sort of in a nutshell, if you ever want to poke around in OpenDaylight, then what you'll notice is that a bunch of the jar files have specific namings. Some of them are specifically called out to be northbound, and that's sort of an attribute of this application or the model of being API driven, where you're hand coding a different a different portion of your code will handle purely northbound API calls as opposed to some of the southbound API calls. So the main difference from the existing model, where a lot of this stuff is static and at compile time, is that we're moving to a model where there's a data store with a set of models that allow you to auto-generate a bunch of the code that is utilized for processing API calls and exposing APIs. So I'd say all in all, goodness on the abstraction side internally. Really the big question is, what are we doing with Affinity? So how are we moving this forward? And we promise that we'll, on one end, level set a little bit and then go into more detail. So Affinity, as we've talked about in the past few NFDs, and we're talking about it in public, is that it's our way of describing the intent of the infrastructure. And when I say our way, I should correct myself. It's not really our way. It's like the way that, from our perspective, things should be described going forward. Now, what does that mean? In reality, if we have this famous by now Microsoft Exchange example, what you're seeing here is a set of VMs on the mailbox side, the hub transport on the client side, and what you're seeing here is a relationship that's being brought together in a set of groupings. And realistically, at this point, what we can say about this relationship, even if I know nothing about the network details underneath, I can say pretty clearly that from the mailboxes will never be talked to directly from the client side. And if we put this to use in our controller, we can predefine certain traffic parameters to be sort of pushed to the side, because they will never happen. So from our perspective, describing this relationship was very important, because nothing out there gives us that same information. Looking at the wire won't tell us what the intent was, it'll tell us what's happening right now. So really we want to just group stuff, and we want to say something about the importance of that relationship. And what's the other thing that's important to note here, we don't have to specify an affinity for every single thing in the network. It's perfectly fine to let L2 and L3 networking just sort of roam freely, but it's specifically for the stuff that you care about that we really want to say something about it. So what this looks like, and I'm almost embarrassed to put the slide up, it is exactly this simple. There's a group, set of endpoints in it, there's a unidirectional link between them with an attribute tied to it. And ideally, we'll leave those attributes in the qualitative space. So rather than talking about this should be diff sort of code point 2, we would almost be more interested in hearing what's important from a qualitative aspect. Does this stuff have to be entirely isolated? Is this stuff very latency sensitive? Do you care about hop count on this thing? And maybe you're sensitive to some stuff, or maybe you're not. And what we've done in OpenDaylight is taken an approach that kind of combines regular functionality that's in OpenDaylight, and then sort of adds and layers on top of that functionality that Plexxi can offer in our Plexxi controller. More specifically, the isolation on one end is something we'll be demonstrating, and tap is one of the options that we're adding to it. So we have that simple definition, simple attributes added, and the reason we want to keep it that simple is that most abstractions out there are extremely biased, and as a result of that, they're not very well utilized across the infrastructure. When I say biased, you either have something that describes intent or configuration and is very much application centric, and that's kind of it's an application policy. If I just hand that directly over to the network infrastructure guys, they're like, I don't really care which Active Directory part of the structure you're in. So there's too much information on the application side. From the network perspective, I can give you everything, including diff sort of code points, 802.11 sort of handover groups, everything from a network perspective, but it will be of no use to the application side. So what is the best single thing to do going forward from our perspective is to find that area where there's the least amount of intersection but most amount of relevance for both. In other words, find something that is so incredibly lightweight that if you don't know any details about the application side, you can find your way in that area just by having this as a starting point. And vice versa, if I need to understand more about the network details, we'll just use that starting point to begin with. Now what we've done with the Affinity Metadata Service is the following. What we want to achieve is controller federation. So we've got Plexxi control, it's controlling the infrastructure. We talked about that today. And what we ideally want to do is see if we can get OpenDaylight to control not just ourselves, but also some additional other southbound plugins. And that's exactly where the Affinity Metadata Service came in. So yes, OpenDaylight supports the consumption of an affinity with a set of intents that are described, part of which are activated in, for instance, Open vSwitch environments, and part of it that's just funneled through to Plexxi control. For instance, Open vSwitch doesn't know anything about the isolate attribute, whereas the Plexxi controller knows everything about isolate. And then obviously the bigger picture would also include getting application metadata from DevOps systems that know more about application syntax than anything else. Sort of blasting through this a little bit, but it's interesting stuff. So the metadata service itself taught us a lot of things about OpenDaylight and how it was written and how it was coded up. I mentioned before that it's very flow-centric at this point. So we've overloaded some of the flows with pathing information from ourselves, and we'll see some of that later today. But in essence, we've worked on exposing a set of APIs on the northbound side to create affinities to essentially temporarily store them. There's no persistent storage yet in OpenDaylight. So once you terminate a control line, start it again, you have to push affinities back in through some way. And we've worked on sort of components that live inside of the service abstraction layer and basically keep track of which affinities are enabled and not, and what the additional flow rules are that need to be inserted as a result of an affinity being specified. For instance, if we specify a tap action, we want to make sure that that rule is executed in the OpenFlow space sooner than sort of regular forwarding. And the other key point that I want to highlight here is we had to invest exactly zero amount of time in writing anything specific for OpenFlow. So one of the key benefits for us was we could very easily demonstrate this by just investing in those areas that we felt were useful. And with that, we basically create an end-to-end picture. And I'm stealing a little bit of Derek's thunder. But in essence, yes, there's a physical infrastructure of Plexxi in the middle. Open vSwitch is on the side, which you would imagine happens in a regular environment today. OpenFlow 1.0 and OVSDB being used to control those Open vSwitches and the membership on those bridges inside of these vSwitches. And controller federation happening through the data service engine. Now the thing, hopefully if we get to it, we get to show as well, is the benefit from an end user perspective is once I have all the topology information and service information inside of OpenDaylight, I can utilize other people's GUI or other people's monitoring systems directly to talk to OpenDaylight. And we've got an example here, a company called Real Status. They have a 3D visualization tool called Hyperglance that basically what it does is it feeds off of all the information that lives in OpenDaylight and shows it in the 3D space, and you can kind of twist and turn and zoom in and zoom out and select data. So that's roughly a preview of what the demo looks like, and that enables end users to not just look at the Plexxi UI, which you've seen in the past, not just look at the OpenDaylight UI. And for those of you who are following Derek on Twitter, this is a rough depiction of what a Plexxi ring looks like inside of OpenDaylight, but also sort of the 3D view for the entire end-to-end infrastructure using third-party tools. So all in all, a bunch of benefits on from an end-user perspective, from our perspective, from Plexxi's perspective. This hopefully brings affinities out there, helps people sort of understand what we want to achieve with this. And that brings us to sort of last slide of this section. That's what do we think is going to happen in the future? Or what are some of the projects that we want to work on? Aside from Affinity, which is an abstraction that is fairly, is fairly simplistic by design, There are some other policy groups and policy activities happening in OpenDaylight, and we're actively involved in those. One such policy project is the group-based policy work that lives both inside of OpenStack as well as in OpenDaylight. It's a higher order policy language that will, we'll have to find a way to, and I think we found a way to kind of deconstruct that into affinities that can then subsequently be deconstructed into any of the southbounds that live under OpenDaylight. So that's one project that we're both invested in and want to see this succeed. There's some other stuff inside of OpenDaylight that has our attention, has everything to do with overlays and virtualization. There's interesting information that our controller can read from the tunnels that are established between vSwitches using, for instance, OpenDove or the virtual transport network portion. There's one practical thing that has to be solved before that becomes a reality. Today, the control planes are slightly different, but more importantly, the forwarding planes are different for OpenDove and VTN. So there's a little bit of kind of combining that's necessary on that side. I think thirdly, and that's certainly not the only three things, but the last part there, there are other southbound protocols inside of OpenDaylight, specifically the Service Provider Edition, that will give us interesting information about the wide area network. More specifically, there's BGP link state information that will be presented and is currently supported in the Service Provider Edition of OpenDaylight. And that will give us interesting information about who is connected where, both to that data center and perhaps outside of the infrastructure. Now, will we go as far as actually controlling that wide area network? I don't think so, but it will at least be helpful for us to know who's going where and which part of the data center is the front end and which part is the back end, so to speak. And then the more of that type of information we have at our disposal in the DSC, the more troubleshooting we can do from a single point of contact. Now with that, we're getting to the end here of this section. Shameless plug, we're actually adding people to the team that are working on this. So if you're online and looking for sort of interesting projects, we're very excited about this stuff. We're adding software hackers to OpenDaylight and Plexxi project. So
today's presentation partially sponsored by Plexxi HR.
All kidding aside, questions? This was a fairly brief overview, but.
So you're still very bullish on OpenDaylight, clearly.
I am, and not just me. The fact that I'm positive about it might be because I'm on licorice.
Yes.
Lots of it.
Multi-licorice, perhaps. But yeah.
No, I'm very bullish about it. It's I'd say my personal view is that you're absolutely witnessing a bit of the Silicon Valley filter bubble. So the people working on it, there's lots of it here in Silicon Valley, and luckily it's expanding a little bit to outside of the U.S. as well. I think the area involvement that we've seen not enough of yet is actual end customers, service providers, and large enterprises. There has been some interaction, but I think a lot of those companies are looking at figuring out what can you really do with OpenDaylight before sort of putting in extra hours. But I'd say yes, this release is a good starting point to get to dip your toes in the water, so to speak. Yeah. And we're certainly progressing on both our own southbound type of plugin as well as.
And the vendor, I mean, I'm asking some fairly high-level business questions here, but part of what I'm being asked to say is, vendors who support OpenDaylight are often criticized by vendors who are less keen on OpenDaylight, shall we say, and saying that it's not as strong. Whereas I feel I think OpenDaylight is going to be the winner on the trajectory.
The trajectory, right? Yeah. Going from nothing to version 1.0 in 10 months.
Yes.
Yeah. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, that doesn't mean.
You draw that line out, and then you say, what's the next release look like? When they don't have to work through all the political ramblings of the early vendors vying for control. That's a very, I apologize. I don't have a mic, but
yeah.
You do.
Yeah, wait. Here you go.
But I guess what I was saying is that if you look at in 10 months to go from a concept or founding a company to a version 1.0 product that's shipping is ridiculous. You don't see that very frequently. And that's with having to work through developing an operating cadence, an operating model, voting through a board, figuring out funding, and nominating people to lead it, which they didn't even fully come on board until halfway through. If you look at the trajectory of where it's going, I think I think that the people who dismiss it out of hand, I think are being somewhat naive. That's not to say it's guaranteed to succeed. No. But if you had to, like, if I had to, place a bet and said, where do I want to bet as a customer, I'd have to include that. The piece that we have to be mindful of is that when you have a corporate product, you have a go-to-market engine that's sitting behind it that helps drive adoption. When you have an open source project, it's difficult to have someone, that go-to-market arm isn't quite as strong. So who's the sales team for OpenDaylight? Yeah. Who represents it? And it becomes more of a collaborative effort. I think this is where the community has to start helping. Because individual vendors, on the dev side, they'll support it. When it gets down to like some leaf node sales guy in the meeting, is he saying, let me lead with OpenDaylight and then bring my company's kit behind it? Yep. That's not the selling motion, right? So
and there's no value in the controller inherently. So
right.
Vendors themselves producing 5 different controllers doesn't add value to the solution per se. But having your app, like your Affinity app, on top of the OpenDaylight controller makes perfect sense.
Well, and I would say the simple question around controllers is ask people, anyone who has a commercial controller, just ask the question, what does your controller do? Because if you can't answer that question in fewer than 6,000 words, right? I can answer that. Give me 2 hours and a white paper. Yeah. Right? If you can't just answer the question, what does your controller do?
Sure, that's fine.
Then how do you sell it?
I think one of the other interesting things too is if you look at what happened with Linux back in like 92, 93 and kind of the early mid 90s, and you see all the excitement that went behind it and turned into maybe not what was originally envisioned, but it eventually became what we see today. I mean, I think you see a lot of those same people and a lot of that same sort of level of excitement pushing into things like OpenDaylight. I mean, whether it actually turns into what we think of it today, hard to say, but I think there's, the open source community getting that involved is predictive of some level of success. So.
Yeah.
My mic on.
Yep. Greg, actually, you made a very good point about proprietary controllers not having value apart from the solution they're sold in. But conversely to that, their hardware doesn't have any value either if the only controller you can use is the one that they produce. If they work with an independent controller, they can sell their hardware to someone whether they're using, regardless of the controller they're using, right? I mean, the corollary is interesting, and it's worth mentioning. We get licensed to that proprietary software that runs on devices. That software has no value without the hardware the same vendor produces. And so it's kind of a wonky model, right? They're finding new ways to extract blood from the rock, and this sort of gets away from that.
And I think that's one of the reasons that all of these commercial controllers have had such a hard time getting a foothold, is because they're all centered on whoever the company is that's produced them and the very narrow vision that they had as to not take away from something that already exists that makes them money, right? Instead of trying to adapt to what they've changed to, they're trying to adapt the change to what they already have, right? And therein lies the entire problem.
Excellent. So, long story short, we're very bullish. We're investing, we're investing a modest amount of resources, but we're putting money behind the thing, and actual muscle behind what we've said. Yeah. So we're happy where this is going. We're looking forward to getting, first actual customer feedback at some point. Whether or not that's within the next, next 2 quarters, a little bit later.
I want to see the hyperglance and Plexxi integration.
Yep, we'll get actually sneak preview. There's a short preview today here, and then there's another event coming up on March 14th, a Demo Friday event at SCN Central, and we'll have representation of hyperglance. So we're doing that together with them.